Again, thank you, Japan Foundation, for your support. It was a real pleasure to see the Japanese embassy join us yesterday and host us for dinner. Again, support from Japan is really important in ensuring that the Japan Studies Association of Canada remains, frankly, sustainable, but also impactful. And with that, you've probably noticed that we designed the panels a little bit differently today, or this year. We've had some more policy-oriented panels. The previous panel focusing on economic security in Japan, really trying to get us a better and more updated and nuanced understanding of what's happening in Japan and what does it mean for the region, what does it mean for Canada. And part of that, from my standpoint, is bringing in the thinkers of Canada in different think tanks to come and knock heads. It's really important for us to don't knock too hard, okay? For us not to think about the region in silos, but think about the region together. It's a marketplace of ideas, but we want to have our ideas cross-pollinating and trying to get us to think about the region very differently. So with that, I've tried to organize a panel this time. It's called a think tank panel looking at Japan-Canada cooperation within the region with scholars and representatives from some prominent think tanks in Canada. With that, I'll introduce them. So on my far right is Jeff Charkowski. He's going to be representing the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and he's going to be talking about Canada-Japan cooperations in the areas of energy and critical mineral security. And then in the middle, Carlos Dade from the Canada West Foundation. And I've asked him to speak about subnational cooperation, prairie provinces, comparative advantages, and Japan. And I think this is a super topic because too often we think about the national strategy, but why not think about regional strategies and how we can engage? Because countries as big as Canada have various comparative advantages. There may be a place for sub-regional engagement. And then last but not least, to my right is Jeff Nankivell, and he's the CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation. He just took up the post about 2 years, and he's going to talk about Canada-Japan cooperation in the areas of environment and agriculture. And I've asked him to do that because I think this is where the Asia Pacific Foundation is headed. And if you're interested in some of its activities, in February, they'll host the Canada and Asia Conference, and these are going to be some of the key pillars of how Asia Pacific Foundation is going to be leading Canada's engagement in the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific. So I've asked them all to speak for maybe 5 or 10 minutes on these topics, and then I'm going to ask them questions, and then we're going to open up the floor to have a very policy-oriented discussion. And I encourage you to, again, knock heads. So Jeff, Carlo, and Jeff, if you have questions or different views with each other, raise them, because we have this opportunity to think about these things differently. So with that, let's start with Jeff Nankivell and your initial remarks. Thanks.
I'm imagining a kind of Jerry Springer show type situation, and these chairs are quite mobile and throwable. Yeah. So hello everybody, and I'm a newbie to JSAC. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity. I will say from the outset, I have not been a Japan expert in my career, so I'm really thrilled to be in a room that is full of Canada-Japan expertise. But I am joined by Scott and Momo from Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, who had a session earlier, and so we do benefit from their expertise. I had a career as a diplomat for Canada, a lot of it spent in China, in postings in Beijing and Hong Kong. Most recently 5 years as Consul General of Canada in Hong Kong. But now I'm the CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, based in Vancouver. And as Stephen just mentioned, we are embarked, with Canada having I think quite a significant motion towards the Indo-Pacific region, in the form of the federal government's Indo-Pacific strategy that came out 10 months ago now. There is a kind of a moment of opportunity and ambition for Canada in engaging in the region in a more sustained way than we have in the past. And I don't need to tell this audience that the justly earned reputation, the correctly earned reputation of Canada as being engaged only periodically with partners in the region is something that will only be will only change, and David Welsh mentioned this in his in the previous session, and I couldn't agree more. We really need to see actions in the coming years with resources for Canada to kind of prove its credentials and its seriousness of being a player in a region that does not regard Canada. In most of the region, Canada is not regarded, let's be honest, as being part of the region. So there's a lot of work to be done. But the good news is that, if you were going to try to address those shortfalls, I think you would come up with basically what the federal government has come up with, which is a strategy accompanied by a significant commitment to invest resources. And what remains to be seen is how effectively those resources will be deployed. We're also at a moment where there are new opportunities, new openings for Canada to engage. So we're not just, I think, knocking on the door saying, will anyone pay any attention to us and let us in? We're actually at a moment where we have longstanding partners with whom we've had degrees, varying degrees of close cooperation over the years in the form of Japan and South Korea. And, these are deep and rich relationships. I don't need to tell this audience, but I also heard from people when I started as the CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, based in Vancouver 2 years ago, when I was talking to stakeholders of different types about Canada, Japan, what I was hearing was that the relationship had been allowed to languish on both sides over the last couple of decades, but there was a potential for new momentum, and I think we've really seen that with visits, with new agreements. And so there's new energy. There's an opportunity. I think in Japan, Canada has a real potential to actually make the limited resources that we have as a upper medium-sized economy. And by the way, let me just say, we don't have a small economy. There are only 8 countries in the world that have a bigger economy than Canada's. We should not lose sight of that fact. There's like 220 members of the UN who have smaller economies than Canada's, but in terms of the resources we can bring to bear in the Indo-Pacific region, of course, we have serious limits. So we really need to look for partnerships. And so I've been asked to address 2 aspects of this. One is on environment, and the other is on agri-food. And so when we look at environment, I think in terms of a practical focus, like what can we do together? From the Canadian side, we need to look at what are the tools that we have as Canada. So one of the tools that we have in the Indo-Pacific region is longstanding development cooperation or development assistance programs. And there are significant new investments committed by the government of Canada under the Indo-Pacific strategy for official development assistance spending and investment in the region for some specific purposes. And one of them is, it's actually one of the largest single pieces out of $2.5 billion of funding committed for the Indo-Pacific strategy. There's $750 million for Canada's relatively new development finance institution, FinDev Canada, to invest in small and medium infrastructure projects that will be sustainable and that will address issues such as climate change resilience. And so in terms of practical suggestions, I think this is one that offers rich opportunities. Japan has been for many decades, a huge investor in infrastructure projects all across the region. I think there may be a particularly interesting strategic opportunity for Canadian institutions and investors and companies to work with partners from Japan in the Pacific Islands. This is an area, it gets some mention in the Indo-Pacific strategy. There is a commitment in the Indo-Pacific strategy to open for the first time some form of a diplomatic mission for Canada in Fiji. That I think is a good start. You can search high and low on the web. You won't find much about that. But I think in the coming months, there'll probably be some announcements about what form that will take. But there is an opportunity to do some things in the area of investing and bringing our both investment dollars as well as technological capabilities to pursue projects in the Pacific Islands region with partners in the Pacific Islands that would also align very nicely with our geopolitical, geostrategic interests for the fairly obvious reason that there is a major challenge being posed these days by China in intervening in the region. And I think our like-minded, very like-minded friends in Australia and New Zealand will also welcome a helping hand in that region. So I think this is one area, and in the Indo-Pacific strategy, we talk specifically, Canada talks specifically about using this $750 million that FinDev will have to deploy as something that can be co-invested in the context of the G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure. And the Pacific Islands are not the only place where this can be done, and the absorptive capacity there is not high. But in other places in the region, as part of a coherent response to the Belt and Road Initiative by like-minded countries and allies, including the United States and Japan, there is an opportunity also to deploy this investment funding as co-investment. The model for FinDev is to participate in syndicated transactions and to work with multilateral institutions like the Asian Development Bank, like the World Bank, in projects that will be green and will also contribute measurably to prosperity in places that desperately need infrastructure. When it comes to agri-food, we're here in Saskatchewan, so we're really at the heart of the matter. I think it's important for Canadians outside of Saskatchewan to understand that in Asia, food security is really, I think, for national leaders in Asia, it's probably actually on a day-to-day basis the number one worry. And as it should be, this is the most basic of human needs, and we're in such a disrupted global and regional environment that food security is top of mind. And I think for Canada, having our official development assistance tools that we can deploy in this area with long-standing traditions and experience of cooperation in developing countries right across the region in helping to develop their agricultural sectors. There are opportunities for us to work together, but Canada has other tools in agri-food and other assets. And again, here in Saskatchewan, you're really at the epicenter here of where Canada is a world leader in some very significant aspects of agricultural and food technology, especially in terms of the carbon footprint. Saskatchewan is an absolute world leader, and unusually for Canada, is a producer of commodities on a measurably significant global scale. And so I think there are opportunities in the agri-food sector when it comes to working together in areas of technology, cooperation, and also investment in the kinds of infrastructure and the kinds of soft infrastructure, institutions, market mechanisms, and so on in developing countries in the region, where we can bring the assets of Canada and Japan to bear. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from others about what it is that the Japanese side will be able to bring to the table on those things.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Really, lots to chew on in terms of your key points. I'm trying to layer this discussion because I think that Jeff provided kind of the macro view, and I think Jeff from MLI will also have more of a macro view, and then Carlo will focus on a more regional view. So I'm going to throw the mic to Jeff from MLI.
Can you hear me? Yes, there it is. Thank you, Stephen. It's an honor to be here. I thank the organizers for the invitation. It's great to see my old friend Jim Thiessen again after so many years. My background, 26 years in civil service, mostly in Alberta, but also a stint with Foreign Affairs. I ran a consulate in Japan. And even with Alberta, I spent about 14 years off and on in Japan doing various things. So I've had I have a stake in the country. Went back and did my PhD in energy science. And then I've been basically an academic and a researcher since then. Today I'm here with my Macdonald-Laurier Institute hat on. I also teach at Royal Roads University. My research and my interests really lie at the nexus of energy, geopolitics, and the Indo-Pacific. So that's where I try to concentrate my work. So I'm going to speak to you about that. And I'm just going to dive into a little more detail about the Canada-Japan energy and critical minerals relationship, because I think this is the most exciting thing going between Canada and Japan right now. I think it's really, really significant. In terms of Canada's broader Indo-Pacific relations, we got poor relations with China. Now we've got poor relations with India. That makes Japan that much more central and important in the Indo-Pacific strategy, as far as I'm concerned. And so I'm going to play that one up for a while. But I do hope that we can repair our relations, and we do need to engage with both of those other countries. But Canada actually has a greater potential for trade and economic cooperation with Japan than it does with either China or India, at least in the short to medium term, in my view. Unlike Canada's trade balance with China or India, trade with Japan is quite balanced between imports and exports. We export about $18 billion to Japan, and our exports just this in 2021 over 2020 or 2022 over 2021, we're up 24%. That's pretty significant. And I don't know if that's the greatest percentage increase with all our trading partners in Indo-Pacific, but it must be close to the top. Anyway, it's a big jump. The last presentation talked about economic security. Security increasingly underpins much of the Canada-Japan relationship in multiple dimensions. So we've got economic security, geostrategic security, traditional and non-traditional security, this kind of way I think of security in those four domains. For Japan and Canada, efforts at enhancing our mutual economic security is the most prominent and increasingly important element of the relationship. And in that dimension, economic security, the level and pace of cooperation in the energy and critical mineral sector is probably the most promising and economically significant element right now. And I think it holds great promise for the future. We've seen trade and investment in these sectors on the upswing. In the last presentation, you heard that two memorandums of cooperation were signed recently between the Ministry of Economy and Industry and Industry Canada and Foreign Affairs on battery technologies and also on critical minerals. So there's a lot of cooperation there. I think these efforts with Japan may also provide Canada some longer-term geostrategic advantages in the Indo-Pacific and a jumping off point for expanding our trade and investment relationships with other countries in the region, such as South Korea, but others as well. So these facts alone justify Canada and Japan forging a formal strategic partnership agreement, I think. I think maybe David was talking about this, but I think we're working together now on so many fronts, and it's expanding. It's surprising in a way that we haven't pulled it all together into a comprehensive agreement and called it a strategic partnership agreement, but we haven't yet done that. I hope we do. If you want to talk about specifics, what are the opportunities in energy? I can certainly do that. Canada, as you know, Japan is 85% reliant on imports of fossil fuels. And in fact, their primary energy consumption in Japan is still 85%, roughly, dependent on fossil fuels. There's a number of reasons for that. They haven't been able to restart nuclear reactors at the pace that they were hoping to. That's one. But also, Japan is a very difficult place for renewables because the places where the wind blows are far away from the population centers. You have to build a lot of expensive transmission. And solar is kind of limited because of land area. Geothermal is limited by national parks that prohibit development of geothermal resources, and hydro is already maxed out. So they really do have a lot of limitations, but they do have a hydrogen strategy. Japan was probably the first major economy to develop one, and that's an area of particular interest now for Canada. Ammonia is a chemical compound that is composed of nitrogen and hydrogen. It's pretty stable and it can be transported easily and relatively cheaply. And now there's discussions with Japanese trading companies and other companies investing major dollars in Alberta in particular, because Canada is one of the top 10 ammonia producers in the world, and Alberta produces about 98% of Canada's ammonia. And Japan wants that ammonia now to co-fire ammonia with coal in their power plants to reduce CO2 emissions, and they still rely on coal. And also potentially then to convert that ammonia and withdraw the hydrogen from it and use it, liquefy it, and use it for energy storage and for other purposes. So right now, it's really exciting what's going on in the ammonia space and the hydrogen space. Particularly, this is something that's going to happen over time. It's going to take a number of years, but Canada does have a strategy for, and Alberta does, and I think Saskatchewan may also, for ammonia and hydrogen. So that's moving along. The other thing that's exciting, and it goes under the radar, is Japan is very dependent on LPG, which is liquid petroleum gas. We don't typically hear about that product, but it's used in homes in Japan for heating, for cooking. Many homes are not hooked up with pipelines like they are in Canada, so they rely on deliveries of bottles of LPG. Well, that LPG is increasingly coming from Canada. So there's a terminal in Prince Rupert that is producing is shipping LPG to Japan, and almost exclusively to Japan. And that's accounting now for a huge percentage of our increased exports to that country. And I actually met the president of that company just a couple of days ago in Vancouver. They're very excited. They said, we don't need any investment from Japan. We're doing just fine. We've got lots of capital available. So anyway, there's an expansion in the works for that. And then, as you may know, there's the LNG Canada project in Kitimat that is going to be exporting LNG principally to the Indo-Pacific sometime in the next couple of years. When it's complete, they're already talking about an expansion. That's going to make a big difference in our export numbers. And then the other one is the Trans Mountain crude oil pipeline, which is also nearing completion, and that also will provide energy security to countries in Asia as well. So we've got our traditional natural resources, both crude oil, gas, and natural gas liquids like LPG. And then on the horizon, we've got ammonia and hydrogen coming behind them as we decarbonize over the next few decades. So it's a pretty exciting time in the Canada-Japan relationship in terms of energy and energy security.
Thanks, Jeff. Really, this is, again, another dimension of how these two countries can engage, both exploring, what Japan can provide in terms of helping Canada get its resources up, but what can Canada do in terms of a more sustained and meaningful engagement through strong partnerships like Japan into the broader region. And this speaks to the panel that we were talking this morning or this afternoon for lunch with the Japan Foundation, is how can we talk about Japan and Canada? We can talk about it in many sophisticated ways: environment, technology, energy, critical minerals, and so many ways that make it relevant. Let's pivot to a more regional approach or a subnational approach. And here I want to bring in Canada West Foundation's Carlos Dade, who I've done lots of work with, does lots of great data work with his group, and he's going to bring another perspective in. Carlo.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for including the subnational perspective. So often in these discussions, we default to national capital, or dominant business region, mega region, to dominant business region. But in terms of Canada's relationship, certainly with the Indo-Pacific, the prairies, Western Canada, certainly the prairies figure, I would argue, most prominently, even with the presence of the auto industry. Food security has been mentioned here. And again, if you look at the exports of food products, agricultural commodities to the major markets of the Indo-Pacific, we've run the numbers for the 16 most important economies to the west. Sorry, Fiji. And I'm not going to run the numbers for Fiji because I don't think I could find them. But 72.3% of everything we send to the major economies of the Indo-Pacific come from the prairies, not Western Canada, from the prairies. So for such a large part of our relationship, the prairies play a key role. So let's back up a little bit and very quickly, Canada West Foundation, the role of subnationals in Canadian foreign policy and trade policy, and some areas where it's critical for the prairies to be more involved with the strategy and more involved with engagement, or at least more recognized, especially from foreign partners for the engagement. The Canada West Foundation was created 50 years ago to advance Western, primarily prairie interests, but also British Columbia, to advance Western interest in the national conversation, in policy formation in Ottawa. The thinking at the time, 50 years ago, was that a think tank was needed to produce research, rigorous analysis, informed dissemination to assure that Western Canada had a voice that was informed, backed by data and backed by research, to enter into national conversations, to guide Canada, to guide the direction of the country. The motto of Canada West has always been a strong West in a strong Canada. So it's about making Canada stronger by making the West stronger. You advance 50 years and the foundation has evolved to follow Canadian or Western Canadian interests, not just to Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal, but also to Washington, D.C., to Mexico City, to Tokyo. As the West has increased its presence abroad, as the importance of trade with these markets has grown, as provincial governments have gone into these markets to directly represent prairie interests, the Canada West Foundation has gone with them, providing contacts as Asia Pacific does for Canada writ large. We play a similar role for the prairie provinces and for the West. So you'll see us occasionally, and if Jeff invites us back to Singapore, but you will see us in these markets, publishing in these markets the way we publish op-eds in Canada. Now, for the role of provinces in trade and international affairs, So I was just down south in Berkeley a few weeks ago at a conference on North America. And with my Mexican and American colleagues, I made the point that the Americans went first, Mexico was second, this is California, and Canada brings up the rear. But in setting the stage for the panel, I made the point that you can't think of Canadian provinces the same way you think of Mexican states, which are incredibly weak in the Mexican Federation, or even the way you think of US states in the US Federation. Canadian provinces, I told the audience, are closer to, the key word is closer to, not are, closer to Emirates than to US states. So when you think about the North American relationship and the subnational entities, you really can't put the Canadian provinces on the same level with US states. The point to this, in Canada, and this really shocked the audience, we have 2 internal free trade agreements. And you could see the gears spinning and grinding to a halt in the minds of the Mexicans and the Americans. What do you mean an internal trade agreement? And why the heck would you have 2 of them? But the reality is in Canada, provinces in areas of provincial jurisdiction have powers, responsibilities, and capacities that our colleagues at other subnational governments don't. There are, of course, everyone knows the examples in Europe, some of the autonomous regions that you can pick the other cases, but certainly within the North American context, it's not something with which our foreign partners are familiar. The Europeans, of course, when they were negotiating the free trade agreement with Canada, knew this well enough to insist that the Canadian provinces were in the room when the agreement was being negotiated, so the EU could have assurance that what was being negotiated was agreed upon. And indeed, with the NAFTA trade agreement, it took 20 years for the provinces to sign on to the government procurement chapters, despite the Americans assuring, or the Canadians assuring the Americans that it was just a technicality. And after the first Canada-US agreement was done and the first NAFTA was done, oh, don't worry about the provinces. They'll come along. We'll take care of it. The Europeans saw that experience and chose to interact directly with provinces. So that's a different reality. We're not poisoning something that's not based in the Canadian reality when we talk about provincial involvement in foreign affairs and certainly on the trade front. So with the Indo-Pacific strategy and our engagement with Japan and the countries of the region, what are some areas where provincial or the provinces, especially the prairie provinces, can play a stronger role and indeed must play a stronger role? First, I would argue, is involvement with the strategy. Now, here we have a real problem in Canada in that there are 2 silos. The provinces are convinced that they weren't consulted on the strategy. The federal government, Foreign Affairs, is convinced that the provinces were. So we have a starting point with the strategy where there is this unbridgeable difference, and talking to both sides, both are not being disingenuous. Both are really convinced that either they were excluded or that they were consulted. So a fundamental difference, and I think a weakness of the strategy abroad, is this appearance that as a country, the starting point for the strategy may not be that everyone's on the same page. So we're doing work with the federal government and with the provinces to try and bridge that gap, whatever role we can play in supporting and helping. But for the strategy and engagement itself, there are 2 areas where the provinces need to play a key role. One, as has been mentioned, food security and agriculture. 72.3% of everything we produce comes out of the prairies. The major research centers for food science, agricultural science, the plant protein supercluster, these are all resources that are based on the prairies. The amount of money that Saskatchewan has put in to global food security means that the work on food security is going to have to come largely from the prairies. It can't come from Guelph, though they can contribute, but given what's exported, given from where it comes, it's going to have to be the prairies. In this regard, the prairies are playing a role in trying to determine the implementation of the agricultural office in the region. So as part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, we're establishing a Canadian agricultural office in the Indo-Pacific. It will be based in Manila. The question at play is whether this office will be devoted to market access, so gaining access to markets, lower tariffs, more Canadian products going in, or will it be dedicated to surviving, having market access? In other words, dealing with non-tariff barriers. Once you have market access, in the case of China with canola, India with pulses, you find yourself vulnerable to the shutting of the market or to the use of non-science-based measures to exclude products for legitimate reasons, political reasons, take your pick. But our ability to be able to manage the trade relationship on agriculture is very weak in the region. This is where a country like Japan is very important. Not having these issues to the same degree, or the perception in Canada of not having the issues to the same degree, makes Japan a more important partner, not only for trade, but on working on non-tariff barrier issues in the region. So this is something that the provinces, the prairie provinces, are working very hard on to assure that non-tariff barrier measures or protection for non-tariff barriers is the priority in agricultural engagement, not the old market access. So surviving market access, the capacity to do what Australia and the Americans do, that we raise that capacity in Canada. The other issue is actually getting goods to market. Our reputation as a reliable supplier of goods is been on a 10-year decline. If you look at the World Economic Forum's competitiveness index rankings of reliability of trade infrastructure, of confidence in trade infrastructure, Canada has suffered a 10-year decline from being viewed in the top 10 globally to winding up at 32nd the last time the rankings were done. This is an issue where the federal government has shown no real interest. Housing infrastructure, yes. Green infrastructure, yes. New infrastructure, yes. But trade infrastructure, moving goods to market, has been absent. The provinces are taking the lead here in two ways. The Council of the Federation, the meeting of the premiers, issued a call for a national trade infrastructure plan at their July meeting in Winnipeg. This is something we've been working on for a decade, and they've adopted our call for a national trade infrastructure plan. Every premier across the country on board for this. The second is that the prairie provinces have a memorandum of understanding on trade infrastructure, where they're actually working together on planning, adopting international best practice. So if we are going to see improvements, it's going to come from the prairies first. And that's a huge signal, I think, to markets like Japan that are worried about our ability to get to markets. We're also looking at economic corridors and new routes. And we're finally seeing progress on that front because the provinces are working together for, I think, one of the first times. So there are some really important advances in our engagement, concrete things that are happening on the prairies. And I think in terms of key markets like Japan that are worried about our ability to get goods to market, the news that someone in Canada is not only aware of the problem, but is taking active measures and actually doing something about the problem may be a bright spot that can help other aspects of our engagement. And thanks for taking energy for me.
As you can see, we can talk about Japan-Canada relations in a lot of different ways, and we can go down to the provinces and talk about how the provinces can work with countries like Japan for trade access and market access. And as we were thinking about this, how can we have a much more complex view of this bilateral relationship? It's not just providing agricultural products, it's not just energy, but how to do it, how to implement policy. What are the different strategies that we can use to boost this relationship? And then how does this fit into a broader Indo-Pacific strategy? Again, and it should be about national interests. How do we engage in the region to benefit Canada and Canadians? So, Carla, you provided a lot. I want to just keep with you because we were talking in our summer meetings about how Quebec has an Indo-Pacific strategy. we found out that our minister is working on an Indo-Pacific strategy in Alberta. How do you see a provincial approach engaging in the Indo-Pacific, and how would they view a specific partner like Japan in terms of their engagement?
Sure. So obviously, I can't speak directly for the provincial governments. Let me make that clear in case anyone from the government of Saskatchewan's in the room. I don't want hate mail from Minister Harrison. But there are some clear areas where I think a provincial strategy would differentiate itself within the federal strategy. So to be clear, provincial engagement is not at the expense of national engagement, nor is it to cause confusion with national engagement. It's done within the context of national interest. The provinces never moved to undermine the Canadian national interest, but it's differentiation of things that are more important in the relationship, I would say. In that regard, the ability to engage and to meet the countries of the region where they are and not necessarily where we want them to be. Obviously, there are hard guidelines on environment, labor, and other issues. But with those issues on the table, you have the ability to preference certain areas over others. For the prairie provinces, it's trade, it's food. We will not put other issues for the obvious labor, human rights, etc. We will not put other issues through a single lens. The whole relationship has to be looked at. We have to engage countries where they are on other issues. So it's not going in with a colonial or a missionary mindset to tell countries in the region what we need out of them. We're very aware of how important the trade relationship is and the need to work with countries and to meet them where they are on the trade relationship. So I think that would be one major difference. Lose the colonial sort of missionary mindset in talking to countries and, dealing with them on a practical level. As a provincial official, you are much closer to business. You are much closer to the electorate. You're responsible. Folks will see you. If you're in Winnipeg, folks are going to see you in the supermarket if you're the premier. You're just a lot closer to the businesses that are impacted by trade. And I think that brings a different perspective than the federal government, where officials tend to be a lot more distanced and sheltered from the relationship.
Jeff, Energy Jeff, or MLI Jeff, I want you to kind of pivot on and build on what Carlos said in terms of a provincial engagement, in terms of Indo-Pacific on energy and critical matters, and where Japan fits within that. And then I'm going to pivot back to Jeff, because you're going to be charged with the Canada and Asia Conference. How do you see these views and these interests and these relationships between Japan and the provinces and these core areas as a possible area to leverage or to talk about in the upcoming conference next year? Jeff?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, provincial involvement in the resource sector is very, very important, as Carlo already pointed out. And provinces do own those resources, so they're responsible for the development of them, and they generate a lot of revenue from them. And it's in their interest to maximize, the value of those resources and not leave them in the ground necessarily. So they try to do that. In the case of energy, Alberta, of course, is very important, but Saskatchewan also produces significant amounts of energy, as does British Columbia, particularly gas. So the Western provinces, again, are very strong on energy and agriculture. And I think Alberta, I used to be the assistant deputy minister in the Department of Energy, and my responsibility was international energy policy. So they actually had an official who had a role in the international realm, talking about Alberta's energy policy and advancing our energy interests with countries like China, Japan, Korea, and others. I mean, I signed with my counterpart in China and in Japan the first energy cooperation agreements that Canada had ever had before the federal government signed theirs. So, you know, there's some satisfaction in doing that, but it makes sense because, you know, Alberta's in the best position. It understands the industry. It has a good rapport and communication with it. Likewise in BC with the gas industry and in Saskatchewan. And so they tend to see that in their economic interest to make sure that customers for these products, and these are global commodities that are traded in global markets, it's important for them to ensure that they're talking to the right people, and so they do.
Right. So again, Jeff, I'll from the Asia Pacific Foundation, I want you to kind of, you know, synthesize these thoughts. And again, in your upcoming Canada and Asia conference in Singapore, which is in February 2024, bringing together Canadians to talk about engagement in the region. How do you see these opinions? How can they be reflected in some of your activities or initiatives that you're going to be engaged in?
Well, thank you so much for that opportunity and for the platform, Stephen. Let me say, first of all, just a couple of things in reaction to the comments we've been hearing. I would say, Carlo, I'm not advocating that the Pacific Islands are Canada's strategic priority. I'm saying let's position that properly. It's a niche area where there is a bit of geopolitical bang for the buck, and it wouldn't take a lot of bucks. And that's and not a lot of bucks is Canada's comfort zone. That's too good. I would say actually the big strategic bet for us as a country, and as it should be, because we align our interests with the national interest for the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, is on Southeast Asia. That's really where we see the greatest potential for growth, for Canadian prosperity in Asia, and it's the area highly contested and very competitive, and Canada is pretty much the last one to the party, but we do bring some assets as we've been discussing, and it's the area where Canadians and our brand are least well known. It's the area we know the least compared to other parts of Asia. Not surprising, it's the farthest, it's literally the farthest part of the planet from Canada. So that's I think that for us, certainly at the foundation, will be a focus also, because you layer on top of that, like, where can we add value? And we do a lot, you know, on Japan. We're very proud of our longstanding association in administering the Kakehashi exchange programs for the government of Japan that are bringing young people between the two countries on study tours in each direction for over a decade, and other things that we're engaged in. But we really see where we can add value is in helping to shine a spotlight on these areas that are less explored by Canadians. And these are the areas where we also see, these are like the third country areas where we see the potential for cooperation with like-minded partners on security issues, on technology issues, on, as I mentioned, you know, infrastructure investment programs that are kind of a counterweight, and we hope a better answer to countries' problems than participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. So one of the things that we're doing is we have established a new thing for Canada in Asia, which is working with Universities Canada as our partner. We convened in February of this past February of 2023, a major gathering. We got the universities to invite their alumni who live all around Asia. They'd never done this before, and to get them to work together in parallel, which they were very happy to do once they got the concept, was a great thing to see. And then we brought in business leaders, government leaders, investment attraction agencies, technology promotion agencies from Canada, their counterparts from Asia, Canadian chambers of commerce from around the region, for a big gathering. Over 500 people came to the conference Just over half of them were people based in Asia, kind of Canada-connected people, partners for Canada, alumni of Canadian universities. But the conference wasn't about being alumni. It wasn't about universities. There was time for the universities to meet with their own groups on the kind of a day and a half of everyone mixing with everyone, and a half day where the universities and other stakeholders, including major Canadian corporate players in Asia, could meet with their own communities and teams. And the idea is to build networks for Canadian interests in the region. And what we're going to do next is to have 2 thematic conferences, one on agri-food, 2 days, and one on climate solutions, 2 days. We'll do them back to back in the last week of February, February 26th to 29th. And we'll have a gala dinner on the hinge night between the 2 conferences. This will be in Singapore at the end of February. And we're going to do a big general Canada and Asia conference every second year in Singapore. And then intersperse that in the off years, we will do thematic conferences. And by popular demand, the two topics that our stakeholders were most interested in, both from Canada and Asia, were agri-food and climate solutions. And what we are asking of those stakeholders, and I'll put it to those who are here in the room, is these are not Canada-Singapore conferences, they're Canada-Asia conferences that take place in Singapore. So we are looking for the Canadian players, the universities, corporate sector players, chambers of commerce, investment attraction agencies, technology promotion agencies, to bring their counterparts, to come together with their counterparts in Singapore. And so we are hoping for the next running of this, which will be next February, Agri-Food and Climate Solutions in Singapore, to have some Canada-Japan partnerships that we can highlight, and also to use this as an opportunity to advance Canada-Japan corporate and institutional and government partnerships. And so Scott and Momo and I'd be happy to share more information with folks here. But I'm hoping, one of the things that we will do with these conferences, we already started with the February conference 6 months ago, is to stand up some what we call CEO roundtables. This is leaders from the corporate sector, from government, public institutions, universities in different sectors. And we're using a kind of a venture capital spray and pray approach. We're just going to bring people together and see where there's traction to have further discussions. One of the reasons we're doing an agri-food conference is we did a couple of standalone sessions on agri-food with leading players from Canada and Asia as part of our conference last February. And the resolution coming out of those was, be it resolved that we should have a separate conference just devoted to agri-food. And on the corporate and institutional side, there's interest in building those linkages. So we're hoping that we will have a strong Canada-Japan presence at the conferences in February. In both of these areas are areas, I think, of very, very fruitful cooperation, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk about it. And I'll just mention on subnational, we really believe in this at the Asia Pacific Foundation. And if you go to our website, you'll see the way we have organized our research platform. The kind of leading edge of our research platform is something that we call CAST, and it's a kind of a tracking service, monitoring, looking for disruptive events in the sphere of environment, social, and governance developments at the subnational level. And for years now, we've had the authoritative source of information on foreign direct investment between Canada and Asia, which we have always cataloged at the local level. But now we have the tools, and you can see on our website, you can click on a prefecture of Japan, and you can see a list of the Canadian companies that we know are present in that prefecture. You can now also see a list of the foreign direct investment connections between that prefecture and Canada, meaning the city or province, in some cases the county in Canada, where the FDI is located, if it's like a physical plant. And I'm a big believer that the subnational level is where life happens, it's where business happens. And for Canadians to have a more sophisticated approach to engaging with Asia in the era that we find ourselves in, it's not about saying, oh, I'm going to explore, I'm going to open up a business in India. It's like, I'm going to open up a business in Chandigarh because I know there's a market for my product in Chandigarh in northern India. That's the level of sophistication we need. So we're very keen on our mental map of Asia has 1,000 subnational jurisdictions, not 40 countries.
I love that granular approach to understanding the heterogeneity in the region, whether it's the heterogeneity in Japan or the broader region. And I think in Scott and Momo's panel this morning, we talked about the heterogeneity in Japan and how it's better to understand the diversity within the country to design policy. So I want to do a speed round, and this is the tough one. Just a quick recommendation to enhance cooperation to the Japanese government and a quick recommendation to the Canadian government or provincial government of where they should be heading, where should they dump some resources in from your points of view. So I'm going to start with Carlo first, and and then we'll bring in MLI's Jeff and then APF's Jeff. Again, it doesn't have to be complex, but just a recommendation to the Japanese and the Canadian sides of how they can deepen this partnership to have much better synergy in the Indo-Pacific for their respective national interests or provincial interests.
So I'll put this as a worry, and a worry that can be addressed. And, focused heavily on trade issues from arguably the most trade-dependent part of a very trade-dependent country in Canada, I spend a lot of time banging my head against the wall with the Americans and wondering, what are the Americans going to do to us this week? Not this year, this month. What are the Americans going to do to us this week? Country of origin labeling's back, grain grading, and softwood lumber is never going to go away. And then the other 75% of my time is spent worried about China and dealing with trade issues there. The only bright spot I have to my days are thinking about the trade relationship with Japan. It really is, given the quotidian struggles with non-tariff barriers and tensions, Japan is the one guaranteed bright spot. I don't get that with Europe. I get that with Japan. And my worry is in Canada that we take this for granted. We don't invest, we only invest money in Canada where we have problems. We have something that's positive. We don't invest in it until it turns into a problem. So some way to not just celebrate the relationship, which sounds kind of vague and touchy-feely, but really to assure that we don't have problems. Invest to build on the strength that is the relationship. I really do worry that our ignoring the relationship, our taking it for granted, our not being appreciative of the one sane trade partner we have in the world will eventually come back to bite us. So I think that there's a lot that could be done on both sides. We have a Japan Center at the University of Alberta, the Prince, I can't remember, Takamatsu Center. We have some of the assets. Lethbridge has historic ties. We're just not taking advantage of this. So I would really think, just because it's not broken, don't ignore it. You need to make investments. And I really worry day in and day out that the one bright spot in my week is going to hit a rough spot, and it'll simply be because we haven't paid attention or haven't invested in it.
Super comment. Elijah?
Okay, recommendations for Japan and Canada. I would say, well, keep doing what we're doing, because it's been a long time coming, but I think the federal government, Global Affairs and Natural Resources Canada are starting to work a little better, more closely together. And this sort of, we talk a lot about whole of government approaches. We're a long ways from that, but it is improving. I would say, look, we've got significant agreements just signed this month. on critical minerals and battery supply chains. We have a roundtable with Japan on critical minerals. We're already exporting critical minerals to Japan, but there's a lot of room for that to grow. So I think continuing to encourage collaboration between Japanese and Canadian companies, both in Japan and also in Canada, and to continue to encourage Japanese investment in our energy and critical mineral space. Japan's already the largest investor in Canada from the Indo-Pacific. So there's lots of room for that to grow. So keep doing that. That's great. The other thing, I think on the other side of things in Japan, I'd like to see more resources, quite frankly, given to the embassy and the consulates in Japan, because they actually went through some downsizing over the last few years as all the interest in China. Remember, it wasn't too long ago that when we talked about Indo-Pacific, that meant China. And so all these resources were focused on opening up new trade offices and consulates all across China. And now we hear people talking about China's peaking and we've got terrible relationship with China, and the economy is decelerating, and it's difficult to do business there and so on. Yet we have all these assets invested there. I wonder if it's worthwhile, just to be a little controversial, having a review now of what is the, do we have the right level of resources in the Indo-Pacific? Should we rebalance? And I think Japan deserves more than it currently has. So that's two things that I guess I would recommend.
Yeah, rebalance towards Japan. You got the provinces on side of
that. I'm actually not sure I totally agree with that. You wanted some head knocking, and I do want to reinforce my credentials. It's not like, we cover like the whole Indo-Pacific. So it's not like because it's a Japan meeting, I'll tell everyone Japan's the most important for everything for Canada. And then I go to a Korea meeting and say the same thing. That's not our job, right? We're here to speak truth to power, and you're a powerful group. So I'm not sure. I wouldn't write off. I'm a skeptic on China's governance. There are huge risks ahead, I think, with the governance structure that China has under the Xi Jinping regime. And we're seeing, I think, the effects of that in some erratic and kind of poor quality decision-making. But I wouldn't write off the Chinese economy just yet. And I think when we've done studies, when I was in the department and we did studies about allocation of trade resources, China was still way underweight in terms of not just trade, but political. And actually, one of the things under the Indo-Pacific strategy is in fact to expand the number of positions for political analysis in China. I'm not ready to say that we should steer away from that course just yet, because there's still enormous potential there. On the Snapper round, I would say the first thing, I'd like to see a working group convened on green infrastructure investment in the Indo-Pacific region. It doesn't necessarily have to be in Fiji, could be Vanuatu or Nauru, but it could also be, I think Bangladesh is a really interesting example. This is a country that we don't talk about enough in Canada. It's one actually where Japan has really long-standing, has a superb. I mean, Japan has a great reputation all over the place, but because I've previously worked on development assistance, Canada's programming in Bangladesh, I know Japan really carries a lot of weight in Bangladesh, and Canada also has a very good history of engagement in Bangladesh. And if you talk about the absolute number of people, households affected by climate change, you're talking about Bangladesh and Vietnam, I think, as the places that have the biggest absolute numbers. So if you want to move the dial on resilience for climate change, these are two places to do it. And so what I would suggest as a concrete activity, and this could be in the context, and Stephen knows I learned this the other day, how long it's been since there was a standalone visit. We were at a Canada-Japan event in Vancouver 2 days ago by a Canadian Prime Minister. What was it? more than 20 years, I think. You know, because they visit in the context of a G7 meeting or a G20 meeting, but really a standalone head of government visit. It's way overdue, and we don't see joint statements coming out of the head of government to head of government meetings. In the context of something like that, what I'd like to see is the formation of a working group where you would task specific officials in the relevant public agencies. So, you know, FinDev on the Canadian side, development finance folks on the Japan side. I would invite the Asian Development Bank as an institution where we both have a large stake. And to pick a couple of projects in the region where we would explicitly work together. And that could be us also sort of carving out something under the rubric of the G7 initiative on sustainable infrastructure in the region. So I'd like to see that happen, and I'd like to see that lead to actual co-investment in some projects.
I'm just glad that this isn't a panel on China. I think I'm probably the one outlier in the room. But in terms of something else that, yeah, I'll just leave it there. Not gung ho, but just not as I think as. But something that could be added from the Canadian side. Keep apologizing for Da Nang and what happened in Da Nang. That was, I think, the greatest attack on Canadian interests by Canada. And unfortunately, it came at the expense of the Japanese.
Did this come up earlier in the day about the TPP?
Oh,
we're talking about?
There's okay.
Very briefly.
Says someone not worried about Western trade. So at the APEC summit in Da Nang in Vietnam, the Japanese under Abe had taken the lead in keeping the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement alive. For Canadian trade interests, we modeled the agreement without the Americans. We did better with the agreement without the Americans. The TPPs emerged not just as a hedge against China, but also as a hedge against the U.S. under Donald Trump. Abe had taken the lead in resurrecting the agreement. This was the point where the countries were going to sign. Prime Minister Trudeau, at the last minute, at the summit, not informing the Japanese in advance, so that Canada wasn't going to sign until the agreement was made more progressive. The agreement now is less progressive than it was before we changed it to the CPTPP. Anyway, it was a huge embarrassment.
You got the name.
Yeah, he got the name changed, but the agreement is less progressive. So it's one of the singular embarrassments for Canada, but it was also a harm to the relationship with the Japanese, and something for which I think we need to continue to apologize.
That's a problem. You've got a fax coming in.
You know, thank you for this. I'm going to open up the floor for questions, but I think by the nature of the discussion today, you've probably taken home that this relationship between Japan and Canada and how we can think about it is not just in terms of hard security. It's not just in terms of exporting maple syrup. Rather, it's a very complex relationship where if you work with a partner, you know, you can explore cooperation in Bangladesh. You can perhaps work in the Mekong Delta and focus on food security there. You can talk about trade. You can talk about environment. You can talk about food security through agriculture. There's lots of dimensions of this relationship and how Japan fits within the Canadian foreign policy puzzle and how Canada fits within the Japan foreign policy puzzle within the broader Indo-Pacific. And again, this is why I brought together 3 different thinkers to talk about it in different ways. Because too often we think about this region only through the lens of hard security. And that's actually my game. But I think we need to think about it more broadly. I'd like to open up the floor to Q&A. Please throw out those questions. I see David, I see Lee, and please introduce yourself, be specific, and be controversial so these guys have to work for their dinner tonight. All right?
David straight away.
Thanks. That was really stimulating. Thank you all. About 5 or 6 years ago, the Asia Pacific Foundation hosted a conference in Toronto on civilian nuclear energy. And there was this astonishing level of optimism about the export opportunities for the Canadian nuclear industry in Asia. Not Japan specifically as a destination, but mostly Korea, China, and so on, maybe a couple of other Southeast Asian countries. And the idea was we'll be selling these large turnkey nuclear generators. As far as I can tell, none of that has panned out. And now all the buzz is about the small modular reactors at Darlington. And there, the key tech partner is GE Hitachi. It's not AECL. What's happening to the Canadian promise in clean nuclear energy generation? And do we have a future in this? Or are we going to be a consumer rather than provider?
Two questions, all right? So Lee, I saw your question, and then Ben and Scott in the back, and I'd like to pull some women into this discussion as well. So please raise your hand, okay?
Thank you very much for this information. Very informative panel. I'm Sung-Hyuk Lee from Tokugakuin University. My question is, when we usually talk about Canada-Japan cooperation, we tend to talk about trade. But as a Canadian in a Japanese university, for a cooperation to be successful in the very long run, I think academic cooperation between Japan and Canada is also important. And you mentioned about Kakehashi program, and then once I was lucky enough to indirectly take part in that while I was in Toronto. But in Canada, in Canadian universities, as we see, there are a lot of these Japan studies, and even if it's not department in East like Asian studies, there are a lot of these Japan studies going on. But on the other hand, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I'm in Japan, usually Canada studies is totally non-existent. And even in like wider North American departments, it's very hard to find anyone who's doing anything about Canada, although there are individual Japanese professors in the Japanese Association for Canadian Studies, which I kind of tried to join once. So anyways, my question is this something that the Canadian side just takes for granted, or is there a discussion going on to remedy this situation somewhat, to make this more balanced in Japanese universities?
Great. And UConn University.
Great. Thanks to everybody, and thanks for being so quintessentially Canadian. You haven't said a really tough or mean word the entire time, which doesn't seem very fair. So maybe I'll challenge you a bit. All the things you've suggested we've been doing for 40 years with no great success. Canada's mediocre with Japan, it's mediocre with China, it's mediocre with Asia and South Asia. On almost every metric you would use, we're not doing very well, and they don't really care about us very much from anything I can see. They really want our energy, and we slammed the door in their face, and we found a whole bunch of ways to keep doing it. Our environmental strategy is deterring investment in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So seriously, folks, we can have a conference, fabulous. Asia Pacific's great organization. Reach out, Canada West, keep talking about it, right? But our trade is with China and with the United States. We're not doing very well. So I'm really wondering what really will move the barrier. We've been doing all these small things for a very long time with no appreciable impact. So be nasty.
All right, thank you. Scott Harrison, APF Canada. I have two questions. One is, I think, specifically for Carlo. You made a comment on need to reinvest in the relationship, even though something's not broken, we need to reinvest. But if we listen to the keynote earlier today on is Japan relevant today, this is a conversation that's been going on at least since the 80s, and then it picked up in the 90s and skyrocketed, and then it disappeared, and now we're back. So if you read any of the literature or the initiatives from the late 80s to the 90s, it looks like we're still asking this question. So I'm wondering, how do we jumpstart something that everyone's just so comfortable with? My second question is about provincial engagement. I've actually studied a lot of how Canadian provinces engage internationally and especially with Asia. It's one of my side hobbies. And it's also going on. But my question here is, how do we do this? The federal government often says we can't give the information because they don't have the security clearance. The provinces usually go along with the federal government when it suits them, and then when it doesn't, they go do their own thing. And this is especially the case for Quebec, Alberta, British Columbia, and occasionally Ontario. So what needs to be done to bridge this gap here?
Well, I mean, Ken, we could all self-flagellate ourselves over Canadian policy in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, we've been a fair weather friend for decades. When I first went to Japan in 1981, Canada was talking about a closer relationship with Japan, and it's kind of been that kind of talk, but little action ever since, up until now, where I think we've taken a significant step forward by actually having, for the first time, a strategy for the region, which I think is a very positive. It's really late in coming, but I'm trying to focus on the positive side of it. It's missing some things. It's a strategy. It's not a plan. It doesn't have clear and specific goals and objectives and accountabilities and timeframes, and it doesn't have a lot of specifics that some of us would like to see. I think I've been pushing on that, so have others. On the energy file, absolutely, you're right. I mean, we missed the boat on the first LNG round because we got preoccupied, over all kinds of issues, whether it's environmental or Indigenous rights and all kinds of social license issues. And we got caught up in our internal squabbles and difficulties, and that just set back the whole process. Investors didn't see any clarity. And so at one time there was 18 LNG projects proposed in the West Coast. There's still quite a few, but only one has actually had the go-ahead. There's another couple that may be coming up soon, but we'll see. So yeah, we're late to the game. Meanwhile, the United States, they've built 7 or 8 LNG export plants. They've gone in there and they're helping reduce global emissions by selling LNG in Asia, which is part of the energy transition. But we are very, I guess, how can we put it, pure-minded about things like that. If we have to either not sell any fuels or we sell only clean energy. There's no in between, it would seem sometimes. So I find that there's the federal government, and you want us to be controversial. Federal government, on the one hand, all of their external policy talks about green tech and clean tech and climate. When they're talking about programs to Asia, that's the superficial mantra that goes out to all of the parties. But under the surface, the real trade and business that's going on is still fundamentally coal, fossil fuels. Now we're talking about ammonia, uranium, minerals. Yes, we're going to get to clean energy, clean tech, batteries. We're going to have, we're transitioning over several decades to a clean energy system. But in the meantime, people still need to turn on the lights. People in Southeast Asia still want their kids to have lights on in the house so that the kids can study and go to school. That's what's important to them. They don't think, people on the ground don't think about climate change very much. The policymakers do, and it's important to address. But at the end of the day, in Indonesia, if you don't have affordable fuel, you're not going to be in government very long. So there are a lot of social and cultural issues that mean that we're not going to be able to move some of these societies are going to take a long time to move to cleaner forms of energy. And some of the cleaner forms of energy like wind and solar are not suitable in certain parts of Southeast Asia. They just aren't, or you have to build transmission, which is expensive. So all I'm saying is there's a rhetorical story that's told, and then there's the real trade and investment activity that's going on sort of under the surface that is sometimes very different than the narratives. And that's as far as I'm going to go.
I just want to pull in Ms. Yamamoto from the Japan Foundation will be our last question for this group because we're pressed for time. So, Ms. Yamamoto.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Noriko Yamamoto from Japan Foundation Toronto. And it has been a pleasure actually working with MLI in Ottawa, not Vancouver, for the project that they receive the visiting scholar from Kokumonken, the Japan Institute of International Affairs, to do a collaborative research about the Indo-Pacific strategy. And I just, my question is if any of the foundation have any plan or idea to invest for the human, partnership between Japan and Canada for like exchange or provide a fellowship for, I think those type of networking of between in this area to develop the researchers or people, it's very important.
Thank you very much. And again, we're really pressed for time. So if you can address the questions succinctly, and we'll try to get off to the next event soon.
So you're not missing anything with Canadian studies. Some of us are aware of the efforts that continue to be made to revive Canadian studies. It's been cut. It's been a deliberate strategy. Canada doesn't do public diplomacy. Jen Gerson from the Globe and Mail had a great critique of Canada. Cheap and complacent are the two defining characteristics of Canada today. But let me tell you why I'm optimistic about the America strategy. About the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's because I was the head of Canada's Latin America think tank when Canada tried to have one of its two foreign policy strategies, an America strategy about 10 years ago. And compared to that low point, the Indo-Pacific strategy actually has money. The Latin America think tank had its funding cut when we had the America strategy. And how much did you get? So we have learned some mistakes. And again, judging on the Canadian curve, not an American curve, not an Australian curve, but from what you've seen from Canada in recent history, this is the best that we've done. And there's actually money, and there's actually resources. And for Canada, there's a 5-year time frame. But here's the other point. If there's one country in which we've underperformed in a relationship, it's Mexico. Same continent, connected by railroads, trade agreement, important to our largest trade partner. But I just did a piece for the Mexican Council of Foreign Relations, in which I said the relationship is never going to be what we want it to be. It is what it is. And that, in the case of Mexico, turns out to be just good enough. We have trade, we cooperate as needed with the US. So I think, Ken, and we need to reset our sights for what's possible in Canada. It hurts, but you give up the larger vision. And in the case of Mexico, we have what we need. But the idea of a bigger relationship, getting more out of it, living up to potential, I've given up on that. My colleagues at the Mexican Council of Foreign Relations want to kick me out for that, but I've given up on it and retrenched to what's possible, which is why with Japan, the importance is not fighting for more for it to fulfill a destiny, but fighting to hold what we have. We've now retrenched to the point where we have to fight to hold on to what we have.
Thank you.
So very quickly on a few points, nobody spoke to Professor Welsh's question about nuclear. I don't know. It's an area that I hear a lot about from people who are involved in it. That the small modular reactors as the kind of the answer to at least a big piece of the puzzle to achieve climate targets in the next 40 years or so, is that this is seen as a great potential area for Canada. And for instance, in Canada-South Korea discussions at the government-to-government level and with industry people, this is seen as an area where we can cooperate together to do things in a commercial way in third markets. So I need to learn more about this myself, but it definitely seems to be a hot topic, and not only among people who don't know anything about it, but among people who seem to know a lot about it. But I think it's a space to watch. On academic cooperation, Canadian studies, I think I would just add there is tens of millions of dollars announced, not yet in detail what it'll be for exactly, but under the Indo-Pacific strategy, there are supposed to be in the coming years major investments in academic exchanges, in expanding scholarship programs to bring more Canadians to go abroad in the Indo-Pacific region and more people from the region to come to Canada. So I think that's a space to watch. I think you'll see federal government investment in that will be rising. And Ken, I don't think, I mean, I think that's an unduly dark take on what's happened. You know, if you're looking for some metrics, you know, so all this effort over the last few decades and we got nothing to show for it, I don't agree with that at all. First of all, if you look at the trade and investment statistics, these things have continued to grow. Our trade in Asia has grown, you know, very significantly. And even with China, where we say we have this terrible relationship, it has continued to grow through the last few years of the Meng Wanzhou and Two Michaels and all of that. But I think maybe a more significant metric is you couldn't really compare the number of companies in Canada that are doing some kind of business in Asia today compared to, you know, 25 years ago. I can tell you who would be able to give it. I don't have this number at my fingertips, but I'm going to get it as soon as I can. Export Development Canada can tell you, at least in their client base, which involves, you know, tens of thousands of Canadian companies, huge, large, medium, and small. There are these companies right across the country that are engaged in Asia, and that would have been like ridiculous to think about, you know, 30 years ago. So I think the dial has moved, and I think in terms of, you know, is that related or unrelated to effort? When you talk to these companies, and most of my career in government was working on Canadian International Development Agency programs. And then later in my career, I became a deputy ambassador and then a consul general and was overseeing our trade efforts. The Trade Commissioner Service, you talk to those companies. I could go out into the streets in Saskatoon and talk to the companies who have engaged in Asia over the last 20 years. And it's really amazing the feedback that we get about how they've been helped by our Canadian trade offices in the region. Also by Export Development Canada, which is an absolutely first-rate and full-service financial institution among the world's leading export credit agencies, and Business Development Bank of Canada for funding tech innovation. These things are making an impact, and there's just a lot more Asia consciousness in Canada today than there was, you know, 30 years ago. I guarantee you. And it's right across the country in a way that it was not, you know, in the 1980s, for example, when the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada was founded. I don't mean that to be overly rosy. We underperform in most areas in Asian markets, not in all, by the way, but in most areas, and there's huge room for improvement. But, you know, it is what it is, as Carlos says. Asia is far away. Businesses make their own decisions. For most businesses, the U.S. should be the first stop when they go abroad. It makes total sense, and we would be wrong to try to twist their arms to get them to go to places that are not logical for them. I think the proper role for public institutions is to shine a spotlight on where the opportunities are and to advise companies and governments about the risks and let them, you know, make informed decisions. And if we get outside of those lanes, then I think, you know, the money might not be as well spent. But if we're in those lanes, you can see the impact.
Thank you very much to Jeff, Carlo, and Jeff. I encourage you to look at the publications of Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Canada West Foundation, Asia Pacific Foundation. There's a lot of good info there. This was meant to be a constructive dialogue. It sure was. A lot of different layers of discussion about where Japan, Canada can go in the Indo-Pacific. Take it home, talk to people, and again, engage in this kind of constructive discussion. Thank you again. Thank you to our audience. And I'll throw the last announcement off to Karen. Karen?